Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me. I like the way everyone, of course, is sat right at the back and left all of the seats at the front empty. It is like being back at university, I feel. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Melinda Cilento. I'm the CEO of the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. Can I start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Laura heard me say this last night, I'll say it again. CEDA is very interested in trying to identify areas where we have strong connections in our community and how we can, and economy and how we can build on those, but also calling out disconnects. And I think one of the great disconnects that we have in Australia at the moment is around a shared understanding of the history of Australia, tens of thousands of years of history, and more recently, hundreds of years of history, and how we reconcile that and understand each other's perspectives on that is something I think is very important. Welcome to 271 Spring Street. Some of you may not know this, but this is the third floor here is the new home to CEDA. We are, of course, in the Australian Unity building. This is their auditorium. It's the first time we've used it, so we're having a bit of a trial to see how it works. But they're letting us use this space. They're very supportive of the sorts of conversation that CEDA is advancing. So it's nice for me to be here in this space for the first time. Of course, with us today, Laura Manley from the Technology and Public Purpose Project. Oh, hang on, I'll let Adrian in. Come on in. You're going to make a grand entrance now.
Yes, I will.
Ta-da. Sorry about that. No. We've got Laura here from the Technology and Public Purpose Project at the Belfer Centre at Harvard. And as a late ring-in, Stefaan Verhulst from GOVLAB at New York University, who will, I think, provide you with plenty of interesting ideas on a really interesting topic. I'm going to let them talk a little bit about themselves and what they're doing. But one of the questions that people are sort of asking as we're milling around over lunch is, what are you hoping to get out of this conversation? And so I'll give you a little bit of a background of why this conversation, why Laura's here, and what we are hoping to get out of it as CEDA. My background before I started at CEDA, I was working at the Productivity Commission. I had the great opportunity to work with the then chairman, Peter Harris, on the Data Access and Use report. And one of the things that occurred to me when we were doing that report, or the experience I had, particularly engaging with the public sector around the use of data and essentially technology as well, was that there was a very sort of almost bipolar view or response to the issues. So when you talked about data access, if you said the P word, privacy, about 80% of the bureaucrats I was talking to sort of shut down, and it was like, no, too hard, too concerned about privacy. And so they almost had a default no approach to the things that we were talking about. And there were about 20%, give or take, on the other end, and I am generalising, but who were almost at the exact opposite extreme. Their risk appetite was really high, and they were very enthusiastic about everything that could be done, and were almost not concerned around some of the other issues around privacy and how we might do this responsibly. And it really struck me that we needed a broader conversation in Australia around the role of technology, the role of data, and thinking not just about, as Laura would phrase it, technology and governance, or how we can use data and technology to enhance government service delivery, but also the topic of the governance of technology itself. And that is essentially what the conversation I'm hoping to start today around. How does Australia think about the stewardship of technology to ensure that technology is developed, adopted, used with public purpose front and centre? And then how do we think about governance and stewardship and developing the right structures and institutions and processes that build confidence in the community that is the lens through which we are seeing technology, public purpose, public interest, tech for good. Because if we don't build that community confidence and community engagement, we are not going to get the sorts of advance and progress that I think we need as a country. And at the risk of oversimplifying this, that My Health Record sort of discussion to me is an example of that. when you focus only on one side of the issue, when there clearly isn't confidence around how you can manage the governance and stewardship of something like that. So that's roughly kind of my interest in this topic. I think CEDA as an organisation that has a reputation for convening people, for bringing people together, for constructive conversation on important issues, has a role to play in this. We have members across government, across academia, across the business sector, across the community sector. And that is absolutely the space that we need to be playing. We have to be across all of these sectors and having these conversations and thinking about how we build stewardship if we're going to make progress. So that's CEDA's role, as I see it. And what do I want out of this? I'm really interested to understand, I'm getting insights from these two about the work that they're doing and what we might think, how that might translate here to Australia. But I'm interested in your views as we have this conversation today around what resonates, what you think makes sense in Australia, where you think Australia is, and what you think CEDA should be doing in this space. I can give you a question on notice, but this is where we're heading with this conversation. So it is a conversation. I've told both of them this is informal. I want them to throw some ideas at us, and then we'll be looking for feedback from you, and I will be out and about in the weeks and months after this week trying to understand where and how CEDA can play a role. So slightly long-winded introduction. I do like to just also say, Stefaan's just lent in on the back of an email exchange, so thank you for that. Laura also agreed to come out from the US on the basis of me reaching out through an email and then picking up the phone. I just think that's fantastic. I really appreciate the spirit of that. Someone who's passionate about what they're doing and really keen to share those ideas. And on the basis of that has just lent in. And I'll be honest, we've been flying by the seat of our pants and how we pull this topic together. We're still flying by the seat of our pants, but it's really been helpful and fantastic that two people who are right at the forefront of this conversation feel it's important enough to play their part in being here and advancing the conversation here in Australia. So with that, thank you. And I'll hand over to Laura to just talk a little bit about who she is and then a bit about what they're doing with the Technology and Public Purpose project. And then I'm going to flip to Stefaan, and I think Stefaan's doing some really interesting work. He mentioned words like collective intelligence and collective accountability, open data, the use of corporate data, and I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit about how he sees Australia and the sorts of issues he thinks we should be thinking about. But first to you, Laura.
Great. All right, hello. My name's Laura Manley, and I'm very excited to be here with all of you. Thank you so much, Melinda and CEDA, for having us all the way from the States. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about the work we're doing at the Harvard Kennedy School to address sort of the conversation on tech ethics. So when we think about tech and public good, there are sort of two sides of the spectrum, oversimplification, but generally speaking, there's tech for governing better and tech for public service delivery. And on the other side of the spectrum, there's the governance of tech to protect citizens from some of the downsides of new technologies. So on that spectrum, the work that we do is more on the governance of tech side, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. And I think Stefaan, some of the work that GOVLAB does is sort of in the middle and the other side, but correct me if I'm wrong. So anyways, a quick background on the Tech and Public Purpose project. When former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter left the White House in 2017, he decided that outside of protecting our citizens through the military, the challenge of our time was ensuring that new technologies are protecting the public and that we're actually benefiting from all of the fantastic things that can come from new technologies. So he was actually mentored by many of the scientists and engineers that developed the nuclear bomb. So deeply ingrained in him is this idea of responsibility as a new technology is developed and then deployed out into the world. So we began having conversations about what was happening with tech, both in the US and elsewhere. We'd talk about mis and disinformation campaigns causing extreme polarization politically, but also leading to violence and extremism all over the world. We talked about the use of new technologies like facial recognition, creating bias and discrimination in sectors all over the world. We talked about the seeming loss of individual privacy with all of these new devices tracking our whereabouts. And then we started to talk about the biotech revolution and how we didn't want to make the same mistakes with gene editing and gene drives in the way that we have with just letting our data flow freely for everything, and in some cases without us even knowing. So we decided to launch this new initiative called the Technology and Public Purpose Project. It's a collaboration between MIT, Harvard, and Stanford. We have a pretty broad mandate. We work to ensure that emerging technologies are developed and managed in ways that protect the public good. And when we talk about emerging technologies, we're talking about a pretty broad spectrum of emerging tech. We focus on everything from deep fakes to asteroid mining to gene drives and genome editing technology. So what we're interested in doing is actually researching, convening experts, and then providing policy recommendations on these emerging technologies to make sure that as they're deployed into the public, we're thinking about public purpose instead of just moving fast and breaking things. Why do we say public purpose? The Secretary says public purpose because the concepts of privacy, safety, security, inclusion, transparency, and accountability aren't things that can be solely achieved through public policy. It also can't be achieved just by the business community or by academia or by civil society. It's the kinds of fundamental values that all of these different groups together need to come together and work towards to uphold. To guide our strategy, given the fact that we're working across all of these industries and across all of these very, very different technologies, we started to look at the technology development process. How many people are familiar with the tech development process? A few people. So it starts off with basic science, then it goes to applied science, then product development, and then production and ongoing management. We wanted to evaluate where people were thinking about public purpose or societal impacts as a new technology develops. And we identified a couple different areas where we thought we could make a meaningful difference. So all the way at the beginning, before a new technology is developed, we thought it's really, really important to be educating computer scientists, engineers, doctors, lawyers about tech ethics from the get-go. So what would the equivalent of a Hippocratic oath be for engineers or computer scientists? At Harvard and MIT, we've launched several courses that are focusing on tech ethics that are mandatory across the university. And I know there are several other universities around the world, including Stanford and MIT and Georgetown and University of Virginia, that are making that a mandatory requirement for their students. Later on in the tech development process, when we're thinking about product development, we thought there was a leverage point where we could think about the investor community. So when you think about Facebook and Amazon and Apple, a lot of the big tech companies that are very integrated in our lives today, they started off as venture-backed ideas. So there's an opportunity here if investors, early stage tech investors are demanding that these entrepreneurs are considering the societal impacts of their investments. So we've developed several early stage commercial tech due diligence tools that several GPs have started to use. Later on, when we're all the way at the end of the tech development process and the new technology is out in the world, we thought it would also be important to make sure we're educating policymakers. We do regular trainings in the US for members of Congress to make sure that they're understanding the new technologies that they need to regulate, but also have the appropriate tools in mind if they're preparing for a hearing, so we don't have another Zuckerberg trial where they're asking about tubes in the internet, but they can actually ask appropriate kinds of questions. We're also working to develop or reinstate a new tech evaluation body, which was originally defunded in the 1990s, called the Office of Technology Assessment. We're hoping to get that reinstated so Congress has an independent advisory body on new science and tech issues. And then the last thing we're doing is this thing called the Tech Spotlight. We think it's an important measure that cuts across all of the different stages of the tech development process to raise awareness and recognize the organizations, products, initiatives that are doing a good job to be proactive in thinking about public purpose as a new technology is developed. I just saw yesterday that Jack Dorsey from Twitter is now saying that Twitter will no longer run political ads or any things that could be conceived as politics, that's something we would want to recognize. In the States, there's an act that would require all political advertisements have the funding disclosed. That's something we would want to recognize. I know Tim Berners-Lee has recently talked about a new compact for the internet and something that governments and business and civil society could sign on to. That's something we would want to recognize. So those are the areas of work of the TAP project. We're fairly new, about a year and a half old, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about the Australian context and how you're thinking about tech ethics.
Thanks, Laura. Hold your questions, because we'll have a free-ranging conversation in a minute. Stefaan, tell us a bit about GOVLAB, or tell us a bit about yourself and tell us a bit about GOVLAB and what your focus is. I think one of the really interesting things is obviously the focus on open data, but increasingly thinking about data from the corporate sector as well, and how that can be used.
Sure, and thanks for having me here. And it's always delighted to be on the same. Always delighted to be on the same panel with Laura, who we've worked with many years ago when we started GOVLAB as well. And so, as mentioned, I'm Stefaan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of GOVLAB, which we founded about 6 years ago, and I will focus on that in a second. But before I co-founded GOVLAB, I was at a private foundation, which is called the Markle Foundation, and I was head of research. But before I became head of research, I was the first director of internet governance, and I always had to explain what does it actually mean, and so no one actually has heard at that time. Now, of course, there's a lot more focus on how do you govern technology, which is one of the areas that we focus on. But by doing much of the governance of technology, I came actually frustrated that while we are focusing on governing technology, we never use technology to also change the way we govern, including changing the way how we govern about technology. It's actually surprising, like for instance in the internet governance space, surprising that I always had to go through worldwide to events, and then the innovation that they had in actually governing was to be able to stand in line for the microphone, so that now innovation was that everyone had to stand in line for the microphone. And as I mean, it cannot be true that if you start talking about governing technology, that we don't actually use technology to also change the way we govern. And so that's one of the reasons why we created GOVLAB. And so the mission here is to change the way we make decisions, whether it's decisions within government but also outside of government, that can affect the public interest by leveraging new technologies, new methodologies, and new scientific insights. And specifically, we focus on what we believe are two important assets that one has to change the way we make decisions, and that technology has enabled us to tap into in a far more advanced manner. And those two assets that we look into are, on the one hand, people. So we look into how do we actually understand the supply side of people that we need to bring to the table in order to change the way we make decisions. I mean, as a society, we actually are, we have a total failure in actually understanding who knows what within our society. I mean, when we work with cities, we quite often ask the mayor, do you know who knows what within your city? And then we always have, like, anyway, someone staring and blanking and saying, I have no idea what the asset of people is within my own city, quite often, that can help me actually govern the city. And so we've developed this concept of collective intelligence. Of course, we are not the only ones, where we really try to understand who knows what and how do we tap into the collective intelligence in order to address critical public needs. And so we have a variety of tools, we have a variety of initiatives, such as, for instance, crowd law, which is an initiative where we are trying to reinvent the legal drafting by tapping into a broader collective intelligence than the usual suspects that show up when actually laws are drafted. And so, so that's like one area of work, and happy to expand that. The other area and the other asset that we look into is, of course, data. And so here we've done a lot of work initially with Laura's help on how do we unlock data assets that resides within government. So the whole open data movement and also trying to understand if you open it up, is anyone using it and what is the impact? Because we actually know very little about what the value proposition might be if you actually open up data assets. But the last few years, we've been focusing on corporate data assets, because by doing a lot of the work around data and leveraging data for public good, we came to the realization that actually a lot of the data that one needs in order to improve decision-making, whether it's around climate change, whether it's around financial inclusion, whether it's around urban mobility, you name it, a lot of the data assets that could be useful resides within the private sector. And it resides within, of course, anyway, either social media companies, it resides within retail organizations, telephone companies, satellite companies, ultimately anyone that is using some kind of digital means to document either transactions or document certain kinds of actions. And that, with other words, is basically every single company has become a data company. And so what we have tried to figure out is how do we then develop partnerships with the private sector to leverage the data that can inform public interest decision-making. And so we developed this concept of data collaboratives, because obviously this is not about opening up data assets, because otherwise you would have very little corporations that are actually willing to open up their data assets. So it's about really developing a partnership where you can have access, functional access, quite often to some of the data assets or to insights, because for some decision making, so you don't need to have access to the raw data, you need to have access to the insights. And so we developed datacollaboratives.org, if you're interested, which is basically our hub of activities around data collaboratives. And so there you will find the largest repository of examples on how corporations have now worked with the public sector, with researchers, with NGOs around their data to extract insights that can, for instance, during times of disaster, enable emergency agencies to really know where people move towards, that can enable, for instance, understanding of who are the unbanked and how do we actually engage with them. And so we have the largest repository, and based upon that, we have developed a set of methodologies in order to make data collaboratives more systematic, because it turns out it was always starting from scratch. And so now we have developed ourselves a whole range of data collaboratives. We have one in Edinburgh, for instance, where we focus on data for children, where we work with organizations like Tesco to understand child obesity. We have one in Santiago de Chile, where we have access to Telefonica data to understand gender and urban mobility and the like. And a big conclusion from all that work, and you will be shocked, is that this is not easy. And the reason why it's not easy is because we have a variety of missing pieces that can scale this. And I'm going to touch briefly on those missing pieces and then focus on some other work, perhaps, if I still have time. But I thought it would be interesting, given the audience, to think about what are the missing pieces in order to make data collaborations more systematic, sustainable, and responsible. And the first one is that quite often the demand side is actually very poorly articulated, meaning we see a lot of the, which then creates all kinds of governance challenges, especially if you talk about public purpose. Quite often the public purpose is actually very poorly defined. And as a result, you actually engage in projects, you end up in places that are either risky, because you don't really know what you're actually trying to achieve, but also creates additional kind of privacy concerns. And so what we are doing, based upon my frustration of actually quite often working with the demand side that have no well-articulated question, we have launched recently, with support from Eric Schmidt and the Schmidt Futures and Rockefeller Foundation and a few others, the 100 Questions Initiative. And so here we actually want to, before we engage with the data, we want to express what are the questions that matter, that if we would be able to provide data in order to answer, we would be able to transform the way we go about solving that problem and that question. And so we work across 10 domains. We started with migration, we started with gender, we're working on air quality now, disinformation is the next one together with the OECD. and so on. And for each domain, we have a critical problem owner, like it was the European Commission on Migration, it's the UN Foundation on Gender. And then we try to identify the bilinguals of that domain. Because the other missing part quite often is that if we engage only with data scientists, they quite often don't know enough about the domain to realize, is this a question that matters? And so we are developing this concept of bilinguals, which are domain experts and data experts. And so we build cohorts of those bilinguals, and then we source the questions, what they feel is important, and then we have a public conversation about that. So that's the first missing piece. And so yesterday I gave a masterclass here as well. And so my view is that every city or every country that cares about leveraging data should first have its own 100 questions initiative. I mean, I think, what are the 100 questions that Melbourne cares about? That then you can align data assets, and you can align, for instance, data holders that might be in the room in a creative manner to start answering that question, because you have a validated public purpose to start answering. The second big challenge is that the supply, so that was the demand side. And so we do a lot of work here, and by the way, there's need for a whole new science of questions. But the second missing piece quite often is that private sector, and you will be surprised, and I would love to hear about you and your experience and your practices. Private sector is very badly organized when it comes to responding to public requests about their data. Quite often when anyway, many people ask us, because we do a lot of work with corporations, who should we talk to in corporation X, right, around their data? And I always say, well, good luck finding out, because there is no well-established profession or function within corporations that can sign off on having access to their data. And so we are building right now this new profession, which we call data stewards, which are individuals within the private sector that actually have a stewardship role, not just privacy, but also a stewardship role with regard to thinking about what is the possible public value of our data, and how do we leverage with trusted partners in a manner that don't harm the business, but also can provide public value. And so at the moment we have about 60 corporations that are willing to explore data stewardship. I'm also on the business to government data sharing expert group to the European Commission, and the European Commission is going to make a key recommendation with regard to actually having every corporation that has data that could serve the public interest at least start considering appointing a data steward. And so that's a big shift, and it is related with data stewardship, and it is related with governance, because if you have those data stewards, it's not only about assessing the risk of sharing data or using data, it's also about assessing the risk of not using the data. And I think that's quite often the ethical components that is missing that we need to look into. So I'm going to stop here perhaps, because there are many other initiatives. I just want to plant some of those. Clearly, another big missing part is then the data responsibility framework, meaning we have, of course, many frameworks such as the GDPR, and we have California new privacy provision, but none of those frameworks, unfortunately, are really dealing with reuse of data for public interest. Most of them are focusing on the first stage of the data lifecycle, such as collection and having consent, all important principles. But as a society, we actually have not really defined what kind of reuses of data would we like to see more of, and what kind of reuses of data would we absolutely not want to see, such as, for instance, Cambridge Analytica. But there are many reuses that you actually, as a society, would like to see promoted, as opposed to just banned. And so that's another big area that we do some work on, and especially try to have a broader conversation around as well. Perhaps I'm going to stop here. I could go on forever.
Why don't you stop there for now? So we'll see if there's some questions. I think there's some questions already been tossed to you. Can I just quickly ask one question though before this point about data stewards within businesses? What about the government sector?
Yeah.
Is it something that you've promoted there as well?
So we, of course, at the moment we focus on the private sector, because frankly, no one deals with the private sector when it comes to data, and so we feel like there's a gap here. But clearly there's a notion of data stewardship both within the public sector. There's now, we are now also part in establishing data stewardships within universities, for instance, and we also need data stewards within NGOs. Clearly, anyone that wants to have a data strategy and that has data should ultimately have a more stewardship approach and have a profession. And what we are developing right now, and again, it would be interesting to see whether we should collaborate here in Australia as well, is basically developing some kind of a professional association where there is that peer learning, and it would be very interesting to have peer learning not within the private sector and across sectors, because there's a lot to be learned across sectors on how you steward data, but also have peer learning across public and private sector. And so that's what we are trying to establish right now as well.
And based on the work that I used to do in Washington, D.C., the federal government got a recommendation from the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House that all federal agencies should have a chief data officer, basically stewarding all of the agency's data. So that's a new priority in the U.S. government, and most agencies now have a CDO.
But in doing that, I mean, I really like the way Stefaan has framed this up, in the sense that it's not just about the risks associated with it and having someone has the name, the title steward, but is essentially blocker. I mean, that's not unfair, is it? Is the remit clearly articulated as how we effectively use data?
Yeah, so we did a lot of work with the Department of Transportation and the CDO's office at the time, and they were actually working a lot with autonomous vehicle companies, thinking about ways that we could proactively share a lot of the data to think about rolling AVs out in a safe way.
Right, now, Esther here has a roaming mic. Normally what we do at CEDA events, any of you who've been here before know it's sort of meant to be a question. But I think what you've heard from both presenters is that they're also interested in where Australia's at the moment, or what you think is interesting. So you're allowed to have questions and comments. And if we don't have any immediate questions, I'll throw some questions out to you eventually. Oh, great. Question right at the front.
Hi, my name's Matt Wenham. I'm from the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. There's a lot of effort going on in Australia from the government level and involving academia and business, looking at ethical regulation of artificial intelligence in particular. I'm just wondering, given that a lot of that technology is coming out of the US, what's happening there and what thought's been given to the ethical side? And that's everything from autonomous weapons on one end to things like Cambridge Analytica and the use of data by AI systems. Just interested on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, a lot of this comes from the US. So we did some work with the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard Law School that did this evaluation of about 50 different AI ethics frameworks. And so a piece of that was government AI ethics frameworks. Another part was international organizations. Another part was industry. And another part was civil society and academia. And it was interesting because a lot of them aligned with the United Nations human rights kinds of values. So there was some kind of consistency there, but unfortunately the majority of these frameworks were just frameworks without any kind of real teeth or any kind of recourse or follow-up. So I think we are still very early on in the real substantial AI ethics conversation. I think it's good that lots of governments have started to step forward and say this is important, but it's not enough for Google to just put up values for the sake of values that don't really affect how they're actually doing business differently. We have seen some really interesting research on how facial recognition is discriminating against people of color or people with certain kinds of disabilities. We have seen some really interesting research across the board on how you could think about recourse measures for AI when it's used in inappropriate ways. But I still think we're really at the beginning, unfortunately.
Yeah, and just to build upon that, there is no shortage of AI ethics frameworks, right? I mean, if I see another one, I'm going to just throw it away because we've seen too many of those at the moment. And I happen to be now at an engineering school, and each time when we talk about AI, they stop me and say, what do you mean, right? So there is no such thing from our point of view. And I think more and more we actually, I mean, there are many in the engineering schools, by the way, that I work with are saying, I mean, we're not going to talk about AI in the next, anyway, within 5 years, right? So it's going to be a bubble that might burst. Because anyway, so it's no one really knows what we are really talking about, and so we use more and more the term automated decision making, and then you have a better sense about what are the ethical implications of that, right? If you have actually delegation of decision making to a mechanism that didn't have any kind of human judgment, for instance, and so you see a lot of actually interesting work happening around automated decision making. And in the US, leadership does not, it won't be surprising, leadership does not come from the national level, right? What you see happening in the US is actually what you see is so-called privacy localism or ethics localism, i.e. it's actually, the work is happening at the cities level. And so New York City, for instance, is the first city that has developed a automated decision council that oversees the use of automated decision-making tools within the city, and is now also launching, and we are somewhat part, or anyway, seeking to be part if they ever make a decision. They're also launching a responsible automated decision center where not only going to focus on the ethical frameworks, but also actually on building new technologies, right? So responsibility by design as opposed to just an ethical framework. And so you see a lot of that happening. Same thing like in the facial recognition. Several cities have decided to ban the use of facial recognition as a technology within the city.
The first one being San Francisco, where it's all built because they don't want it watching them.
San Francisco. But again, I think while I'm supportive to, of course, anyway, a lot of the discussions about bias, right, which again has overtaken quite often the discussion as relates to the development of the technology, and it's very important to, of course, prevent that. Again, we need to become more sophisticated because facial recognition clearly might have challenges, but also could be extremely valuable, right, in a variety of settings. And we just need to figure out, right, not just banning it completely because someone else will figure it out that we probably don't want to do those kinds of applications. We really have to become more sophisticated about what is it that we want, right? We have never, when it comes to automated decision making, we have never really expressed what is it that we want to improve and why are we not using it for that, and then test out and experiment why it might not work or what the added costs might be, right? I don't know whether that's an answer.
Esther, can I just, Ming's got a question at the back, but first I'm just going to, sorry, Esther, stop. Can I ask you a question back? So when I was doing the sort of scan of what, who was sort of doing what in the space of thinking about technology for public purpose, technology for good, however you want to describe it, in Australia, the thing that comes up that you can find more information about, or it seems is attracting more activity, is the ethics of artificial intelligence. That's the way we're framing it in Australia. In light of the comments that Stefaan was making, I mean, where do you think we're at in that conversation in Australia? And I mean, it still feels like it's just not episodic, but we've got, you know, a group here talking about it. You've got it in the context of one profession, you know, the legal profession, and then the engineering or science. And then, I mean, what's your perspective on that?
It's sort of, I mean, it is episodic, and it's kind of the topic du jour a lot. And I think sometimes it's the topic that people focus on because in a strange way, it's almost the easy topic because they say, oh, well, we can regulate the ethics of this and it'll all be fine. And there are some much bigger questions about the development of AI as a technology, not so much the technical limitations, but some of these social aspects. So sometimes I think we sort of retreat to the ethics a bit as a safe thing we can control. And there's also this idea that government can regulate that in a lot of ways. But as I said, a lot of these technologies are coming from elsewhere. So there's limitations on how much control the Australian government's got on some of this stuff, and it's very diverse, whether you're talking about AI and facial recognition, whether you're talking about autonomous vehicles, whether you're talking about other sorts of machine learning. So it's still Yeah, I don't think we've quite got it yet. I think there are some bigger questions in AI policy. The federal government's sort of aware of this. They've got a summit coming up in a few weeks that is supposed to be advising on some of the bigger issues. They commissioned the Learned Academies to do a report earlier this year looking at AI in the broad. So it's starting to become aware, but we keep focusing on the ethics as the simple topic, I think. Simple.
Yeah, and just, I mean, again, one of the interesting things that is happening as well in some countries is actually also, again, thinking about how do we actually govern AI in new ways, right? And so what, for instance, has happened in the UK last month was where the RSA and DeepMind basically developed citizen juries, where you then can have a different kind of conversation, quite often a more informed conversation, because anyway, there's a process to actually really unpack the issue without having some kind of a referendum, are you for or against, right, without having an understanding. And so that's another, I mean, that's something that I would advocate for in many contexts, to actually develop some kinds of citizen juries that really can unpack both the positive and the negative aspect of what that might mean. And you would have a much richer discussion than quite often the discussion that we see, which is either led by experts in the field and no citizens takes part, or you have then, anyway, the current backlash kind of discussion, which is all, anyway, meaning they are bad and we need to break them up and we need to, anyway, stop this development. And so if we could come out with more sophisticated ways of doing that, that would actually be and the outcome does not have to be an ethical framework. Outcome has to be at least a more sophisticated way of thinking about what do you want, right? And what do you want to promote versus what do you want to actually limit.
Thanks for that. We've got a question at the back. I'm going to out you before you speak, Ming. So Ming Long is at the back. Ming's just, most people won't know, Ming's just joined the board of CEDA. So I think your first event as a formal CEDA board member.
I've been at other events before. Just to answer your question on the AI impact on people, I'm on a number of financial services boards, and what I would say is that, you know, to be blunt, the conversation we are having at the boardroom, because we are investing in a lot of technology, which will mean that we don't need as many people. But what we've also demanded of our people, of our, you know, predominantly sort of HR teams, is that they have to almost map out the future workforce we need, and then how do we get as many people as possible to transition to that type, you know, of skill and mindset, etc., so that we don't just suck a whole stack of people, which is probably the easy management thing to do, which will mean that you get your profit results and all that sort of stuff, but it's a very short-term impact with long-term damage to, I think, people, right? And so there's that ethical dilemma that's we are still grappling with, which we don't have an answer to, because I don't feel like government's necessarily going to step up to that mark. So we feel like we have to solve it. You know, the comments around what we're doing around governance, you know, sometimes I feel like we have so many legacy systems in financial services. Do not assume that we have our hands on all that data, because the investment we need to make to get it is huge, because it's sort of locked away in really old systems. But what we have done is absolutely, there isn't so much a data governance person, there are committees, because what we feel is that it can't just be owned by one person, it has to be owned by the business, and there has to be, I think when we're talking about ethics, the different perspectives that come from the different parts of the business to be able to govern it. And that's, you know, dealing with AI, robotics, everything, the whole spectrum of information that we will hold. What is helpful, we may not have a data governance ethics. We start with, we're very good at the ethical investment framework. So we you know, say things like, we deliberately will not make money from certain businesses because it's wrong to make money from that business. So we start from, in effect, a core business that we are really good at, and then we migrate that up to data rather than start with data and go any other way. But what I think you'll find, your question around, it was very interesting. you know, is it good that we don't use that data? And I've never had that question thrown at me. I feel like we have a very conservative culture in Australia. For anyone in financial services to share any data, given we had the Banking Royal Commission and all that sort of stuff, it would be, you know, you make one mistake and you're gone. So I feel like it's going to be really hard to share any of that data publicly, even though there may be a lot of public good available from it.
Thanks, Ming. I'll make one observation, which is when we were doing the data access and use work, one of the things that occurred to me when I was out and about talking to businesses was actually exactly that legacy systems issue. And I think there's a perception outside of big business about how sophisticated they are in their use of data, which was completely blown away by, I would say, even a cursory look under the hood in some of our largest institutions with the largest collections of data. So I think, which isn't to suggest that they're not investing in security and taking privacy very seriously, but again, to Stefaan's point about the other side of the opportunity, I think my sense was that it's not being realised in the way that perhaps people externally think it is. Stefaan, I know you want to say something, but also I wanted to draw out something that Laura was talking about last night around. She spoke briefly about this issue around the use of venture capital, the role of venture capital, the role of casting the DNA of technology at its inception. So that DNA being very explicitly for the public good. And the role that investors are now playing in putting an ethical filter over that. So I'm not sure which order you want to go in, but Stefaan, you had some comments, I think, but Laura, I would really like you to just maybe talk a little bit more about that.
So yeah, meaning, first of all, the reason why we call it data collaboration is because it doesn't have to be automatically sharing, right? So, and I think that's what quite often, anyway, is confused. So tomorrow we're gonna release a report where we provide access to 11 types of operational models for data collaboration, right? And some of them actually refer to the banking and the financial sector because, for instance, last week we launched with MasterCard their global data responsibility principles. And so one of and it might be interesting to look at, anyway, from a governance point of view, what those principles might be. They're actually pretty advanced. And one of the principles is social impact, right? Which is that we're not only using our data, or we're not only protecting our data in a transparent, accountable, and anyway, all the fair information practice principles way, we also are going to make sure that we're using our data to make social impact. And so what they've done is they've developed the Center for Financial Inclusion, which is basically a center that leverages MasterCard data. And MasterCard data is very limited, as you might know, in contrast with the rest of the banking sector. But they're using, anyway, MasterCard data together with other data assets to inform, for instance, what the latest report that came out last week was around opportunity zones across the US, and having a baseline of what is the current social economic status of those opportunity zones. Same thing they've done, like for instance, in Puerto Rico during the hurricane, they knew exactly, right, whether actually regions were back, because if there's no transactions coming from the regions, then there is no one there, right? Anyway, from a economic viability point of view. Same thing happened we also work with JP Morgan. And so JP Morgan, for instance, has developed the JP Morgan Institute, which is a very innovative, what we call data tank. And so what they do is they basically leverage all the data of all the JP Morgan products that are there in order to develop economic statistics insights. And from my point of view is that actually JP Morgan Institute has become more valuable on some economic issues, indicators, than the official economic statistical agencies because they have better data, they are more real-time than the typical survey approaches, and they also go into new areas such as the gig economy. They know exactly how much an Uber earns, right? And so they know exactly what the gig economy actually really reflects. And so those are the kinds of sharing. So there's not sharing of data, it's sharing of insights or limited ways of providing functional access. And I think those are examples that might be inspirational on what can you do with some of the data that you might have, while fully understanding that there are risks involved, and especially in regulated industries, you actually also have compliance concerns, right?
So just to address I think one of the first comments that you made about workforce displacement because of AI. So we have an entire research team that's focused on the future of work at the Kennedy School. And a lot of the stereotypical stories you hear about are the truck drivers that are going to lose their jobs because of the AVs, or the person that's going to lose their job working at Walmart, stocking some of the shelves. But what we hear is actually going to be some of the most disruptive kinds of things in the workplace are the high-skilled jobs that are going to be replaced, like doctors and lawyers and those kinds of things. So we put together a workshop with some of the major employers in the United States, such as Walmart, Target, some of the big retailers, some of the big banks. And what they're trying to do is find ways to leverage the people they have in ways that couldn't be replaced by some kind of automated system. So things like customer service and more people-to-people interaction, the things that really you can't train robots to do, such as empathy and interacting with people. So we just thought that was a really interesting way that some of these companies are thinking about it. In terms of the investor community, we sort of stumbled upon this. We weren't expecting to dive deeply into the investor world and thinking about the influence that it had on how a technology is developed. But we started having conversations with tech founders, and we asked them what determines which way you go, whether or not you deeply think about the market or policies and regulations into a new place you're going into. And almost every time it was the investor, whether or not it was something that their funder was demanding. So we started having conversation. We interviewed about 150 different early stage venture capitalists to say, what do you typically look for when you're investing in a new tech startup? They said whether or not the founder was charismatic, whether or not they had a really good go-to-market strategy, whether or not they thought they could unicorn in a year or less. And then we asked about whether or not they were evaluating any kind of social impacts, things that, whether or not they cared about the world, would ultimately affect the bottom line. And most of the time, there was crickets. There were a couple of VC firms that were very proactive, and they were more social impact investors, but we were clear, we're not talking about impact investing, we're not talking about social enterprise, we're talking about status quo commercial investing in tech. So it's interesting, venture capital is the only asset class that doesn't have any kind of ESG framework built in. And we were like, this is ridiculous. Why is this the case? So we've put together a consortium of several leading venture capital firms from around the world that are interested in piloting these due diligence tools that we'll be rolling out. So we have one on facial recognition and emotion AI. We're putting one out on gene editing and CRISPR technologies. But we're again at early stages right now, thinking about how we could change the status quo for investing. I mean, as we've seen, it's taken years and years to incorporate climate change into investment decisions, and it wasn't because all of a sudden investors cared about climate change. It was because they were going to lose money if they were investing in a company that was bad for the climate. The same thing, we're seeing changes now in women and in different people with various backgrounds being hired onto boards for decision making. That's not because all of a sudden they became woke and wanted to hire all of these folks. It's because it's better for the bottom line. It's better for returns. So we actually do believe it's better for returns to consider these societal impacts earlier on, and we're trying to make the quantitative case with Harvard Business School right now.
Yeah, I think you said you're doing some research on that to sort of, in the same way that the analysis of some of the broader issues around sustainability and diversity have been done as to prove the impact on long-term returns, that whether or not thinking about the ethical aspects actually delivers the same bang for buck. Keith.
Hey, Keith Ritchie from Siemens. So coming from a company that's been doing AI for about 30 plus years, it's the issue is not whether or not you have AI. I mean, you use it every day. If you get onto a website, you've probably been talking to an automated chatbot anyway. The issue is actually having the skills to cope with the displacement. And it's not a lack of jobs, it's that there'll be too many jobs available. So if you look at the data from the World Economic Forum last year, they said by 2022, 75 million jobs will be displaced by AI and robotics. At the same time, they said, but there'll be another 133 million jobs created. The issue is that we don't have the skills for that. And 2022 is, 14 months away. So we've got a big problem with skills gap so that we can leverage this. But AI is being used a lot for really good stuff. You know, if you look at the trains in Moscow, run at over 99.9% availability because of data analytics and AI. So they predictively maintain those trains so that you don't have breakdowns. So, I mean, there's really good stuff that comes out of this, but it's having people who've got the skills to actually implement that stuff is the biggest challenge.
Yeah. So I totally agree. So I'm still a senior advisor to the foundation where I was head of research. And so the last thing that we developed was basically a Future of Works initiative, which was called Rework America. It's still there. And we developed a whole separate NGO, which is called Skillful, which really tries to understand what are the skills for the future and how do we get there. And the big takeaway there was that, what is another area that is missing is actually coaches, meaning now everyone says you need to reskill, right? But we actually have very poor understanding of what are the skills that you need and how do we build upon the skills you already have. Because we have a very poor mechanism of actually expressing the portfolio of skills that someone has, mainly because we are still obsessed with credentials and not about skills, right? And we have not found a way to actually express skills beyond credentials, right? And so we need to actually innovate on how do we assess the skills that someone has, because it's most people don't start from scratch, right? I mean, if you're a truck driver, you have skills, right? The question is, what skill would you attain to really get into a new career path that responds to the needs that we have today, right? And that turns out to be, by the way, a data question. And we have very poor data to really make that career path, and we have very poor support for those that are actually need to reskill beyond saying you need to reskill, right? No one basically assesses and says, okay, you are a truck driver, you have that amount of experience. That means, right, that you have those skills. And that means that by acquiring that kind of micro skill, right, you automatically would have a total new career path that sets you up for the future. And we don't have that kind of support, and we don't have that kind of analysis at the moment, which leads to, an empty debate from my point of view around reskilling, because everyone gets nervous and don't know what to do.
Can I, just before Barry asks his question, does that mean that this whole focus on micro-credentialing is wrong?
No, it's not. No, it's not wrong. We just need to know, what micro-credential will get me into a career path based upon my existing skills, right? That actually, is the wise decision to make, as opposed to attain God knows how many credentials and still not be ready for the future without knowing what is the demand. We have a very poor, by the way, and that's up to the private sector, a very poor expression of what is the demand for the future, and we have a very poor support system, both in the education system, but also in actually understanding what are the existing skills and what skill micro-credential do you need, right? At the same time, I'm a big fan. In the past, I wrote a report for the European Commission on the future of education, and my only conclusion that, from my point of view, mattered was that we cannot innovate in education without innovating in how we credential people. Because ultimately, by the end of the day, you can do very innovative work, but it always ends, and now we need to, turn this into a credential. And then quite often, actually, we fail to innovate in how we teach. we failed because, anyway, it needs to lead to a credential. We failed to actually also then understand how do we express that skill and how do we update it over time. And so if there is one thing we could fix, it's the credentialing system. And that would be actually a massive, massive innovation, and would deal with the future and would also deal with actually how we think about redesigning education.
Barry.
Oh, hi, Barry Sterling. I'm from AGL, an energy company in Australia, but I've just been seconded there from the public service, so I sort of got a comment on both sides of the fence there. I suppose that's a form of, data sharing, maybe in opposite of artificial intelligence. So in the public sector in Canberra, this issue's attracted a lot of attention. So there's a data commissioner who really has a data steward type role, but it's balancing amongst all the other public policy roles. And my sense of that, I wasn't close to it, but it was a really important model to start breaking through the instinctive privacy concerns, which are often reactive without unexamined sometimes. And so I think there's some progress being made, and others in this room might be closer to how far down the track, but quite interesting use, even confidentially in government to inform policy decisions, but opening the way perhaps for collaboration. The interesting thing, jumping into a large energy utility, is seeing some of those early, some collaborations that people might have seen. That 7:30 report recently about disconnection data, where it was concentrated. That was using our anonymised data and those of other energy companies. I know there's some collaborations between financial institutions and energy utilities, especially by groups like St Vincent de Paul and NGOs, looking at what combination of features leads to bill stress and vulnerability. So I'm seeing that, and this is as much a question for you, Melinda. How do you see that as a category that business groups think in Australia? Is there a role for calling it something? Because I've arrived in a company where I'm seeing them act as if they've got some sense of data stewards. There's no money to be made here. It's purely a social license sort of use, thinking about vulnerable customers and that sort of thing. But calling it something might be useful. There might be downsides to that. If big business starts talking about sharing data, it actually might make it harmful in a public way. But I'm interested in sort of organised efforts overseas to use this, and drawing on your experience, and then how you see the big business groups, and whether by calling something it might put more organisation, better governance and more proactivity. But I'm certainly seeing really good examples of it, and that's a good thing to see.
I was going to ask Stefaan earlier about what the sort of public reaction is to this focus on the use of corporate data. If I can at the risk of patting myself on the back, the creation of the data commissioner actually came out of the report that the Productivity Commission did, and when we were putting that report together, it was very deliberate for that purpose, that we needed a focal point that was about what the harm from not using data, the opportunities lost from not using data, and having someone who would be accountable for presenting a more balanced perspective on this. And all through that report, the things that we're talking about here today, whether it's data or technology, just the themes that run through that report, which is, how do we create the institutions and the ecosystem and the collaboration and bring community in, so that this is something that builds trust and confidence and is done squarely with benefit first and foremost in mind. Because if you don't attend to it in that way, you won't get the sort of progress you need to see. And so rightly understanding that the community needs to see the institutions and the infrastructure and understand the rules, which I think is a lot of what you're hearing across these conversations. It's about building a knowledge base, it's about building confidence in a system, it's about setting up an understanding of what's off limits, what's not off limits, why isn't it off limits, how, and essentially at its core actually saying these things have been thought about. It just hasn't rolled out without someone giving some due consideration to it. But Stefaan?
Yeah, yeah, we have a whole strategy on how do we actually scale this up and also indeed create a community of excellence and a community of expertise. And so one of the things that I think we need to do, especially in this field, is this field is dominated by naming and shaming, right? And so what we need to do is actually counter it somewhat by naming and faming, by which we actually celebrate practices that we feel needs to happen more of. We don't have that naming and faming at the moment in the space of data. It's all about, anyway, critical, you might actually, anyway, risky, you didn't ask anyone, and so on. And I think if we would have more, like for instance, what we have been working on is like, what is the data stewards of the year, right? You actually celebrate good practice. And by celebrating good practice, you might actually have a more, anyway, people start thinking, well, actually, meaning there is value in data if you do it responsibly. It doesn't mean you don't have to do it responsibly, but we need to change the narrative somewhat. Not, anyway, again, becoming nirvana, and typically, quite often, anyway, when technology launches, everything is then, anyway, the solution to everything. We need to become more sophisticated, but also we need to have like a place where we do this naming and faming. Then we need a place where we do peer learning, because, anyway, lessons, like for instance, we'll have to learn more about how was it initiated, what are the lessons learned, have you measured impact, right? An organization could actually become more sophisticated about what is the impact. What are the variables that determines impact? Like, for instance, we developed the, as Laura knows, we developed the periodic table of open data that basically indicates what are the elements that determine impact with regard to open data, because we really wanted to go beyond success is data has been put on a portal, right? We really wanted to go about, okay, success is when it is used and it has made a positive impact. And so what are the variables to get there? So there's a whole range of field building that needs to happen. And that might be something that existing organizations can do without, again, creating a new one. But that needs to be the focus from my point of view in order to really develop that field further.
And just to build on what you're saying, Stefaan, I mean, beyond just thinking about data stewards, I mean, the reason we launched this new initiative, the Tech Spotlight, is because we've been hearing so much about all of the scary things with tech and how your privacy is going to be lost forever, and then you'll be discriminated against forever. When we actually looked into best practices or good examples of how to be inclusive in your hiring practices and how to be appropriately policing in ways that are leveraging some of these new technologies, we heard crickets. There aren't a lot of good examples. So we'd like to really recognize these kinds of things, whether it's specifically with data stewardship or in other uses of these new emerging technologies.
Which sort of segues, Barry, into your other question around, you know, whether we should be naming it here in Australia, and whether that would be constructive or not. And I think I'm going to lead into a question to both of you that might round out our conversation. My sense is that there is still, picking up on a comment earlier, I mean, if you look at the My Health Record scenario, there is a very conservative approach to data. It is a very risk-focused, privacy-focused conversation, as far as I've observed. And when you look around, there are great examples of things that are being done, but they don't get enough spotlight. But when it comes to using corporate data, my sense would be that many in the corporate sector themselves would be very remiss. Very reluctant to be out there sort of blowing the trumpet on what they're doing, because they would be concerned about what the backlash to that would be. And they would be concerned about how the community would see it, and whether the community would see it as being an appropriate use of their data, and would raise a whole bunch of questions around how that was managed, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think that's a maturity level in terms of where the...
And it can actually come up with results that could produce superficial criticisms of the company sharing it, right? Because,
yeah, absolutely.
You know, and we actually agreed not to, just because the NGO didn't want to make it a company, it wanted to make an industry point where the was reasonable.
And I think Stefan's point about demonstrating, when you can demonstrate impact, that helps with the narrative around it. But my sense is that there would be reluctance to be, right out there in terms of saying we're being very proactive in using this for the public good, because there is still cynicism around the use of data and scepticism, and I think particularly at the moment, cynicism around the intentions of business, rightly or wrongly. So I think, and I've seen this in other areas where business is doing good things, but there is an absolute reluctance to be out there talking about it, which is really unfortunate, because the lessons learned piece is not leveraged into broader impact and better outcomes. But I wanted to loop back and say, one of the things that I think is integral to making progress in this space in Australia is collaboration across sectors. Each of you have talked about that. Each of you are focusing on activities that bring different sectors in, try to get more of a citizen's voice and all that. But what do you think the role of government is in this space? And picking up, Laura, on the a bit of the theme that emerged in our dinner last night, we were talking with a cross-sectoral group where the sense in Australia that we were hearing was that there is an expectation that government can deal with this, that people are looking to government to develop the right regulations, to develop the right institutions, and that is the expectation of the community. And I'm interested in, what's the attitude elsewhere, and how do you see the role of government in these issues? Is it genuine partner with everyone else? Is it out the front? What responsibilities?
Well, in the States, there isn't a whole lot of faith in government these days. Yeah, and actually, we heard some leaked audio of Zuckerberg talking about, if Elizabeth Warren is elected president, we will go to the mat fighting if she does want to break us up. So I wouldn't say there's this general overwhelming sense of collaborating with government right now. Historically, a lot of these new technologies were actually developed by government. So there was a certain amount of government oversight, government regulation, funding requirements for the kinds of technologies that were developed. So I think government did have a much greater role on how tech rolled out and was deployed. But these days, the private sector is the one innovating on a lot of these new technologies. So of course, at least from the US perspective, we cannot do this alone as a government or as public servants. It's absolutely critical that we bring in the private sector, that we bring in academia and civil society to make sure that we're actually informed on the new technologies. Former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter will talk a lot about how he started this thing called the Defense Innovation Board and the Defense Innovation Unit, because the United States was falling behind in terms of how they were really developing new defense technologies. I mean, we are just not where we used to be in terms of our R&D and our people capacity in government. So I absolutely think it's not possible for government to do this alone.
Yeah, no, I think government has a huge role to play, right? I mean, typically, anyway, in the US, the typical discussion quite often is, anyway, do you want a big, small, whatever the role is? But I think there is a huge role, and most people indeed, as Laura said, forget that we would not have today's internet technologies without having the US government made vast investments in DARPA and in basic science. And I do think that is a remaining essential function of government, from my point of view, to actually invest in basic R&D that quite often is not invested by other private sector corporate in certain areas, right? In other areas, clearly private sector should lead and should invest, but in other areas where there is a clear potential, and especially where there has to be some risk capital, I think government has a role to play. But government also has a role to play to become a market shaper. I think government quite often ignores its role as a market shaper, because government happens to be a big buyer of technology in addition to also investing in R&D. And so if they can't figure out what the procurement roles should be for responsible automated decision making, then we are in trouble. I think they should also try to invest in what should be the rules of the game. If we invest in technology, how do we want that technology to look like? And that will, to a large extent, actually steer the market towards those kinds of standards, those kinds of technologies. And I think government as a market shaper is a huge potential, in addition to a convener of different stakeholders, right? But again, it depends on the level of trust, and that will be contextual wherever you are. I think if the White House at the moment would convene a group, I think it would be probably considered as not really a serious effort. But if it's convened, for instance, at the city level, right, then depending on what cities, you would probably have actually the commitment to really figure out what should we do with regard to certain kinds of technologies within the cities that impact people's lives, for instance. So these are just a few examples, and clearly, policy and legislation, we have not even focused on that. But I think there are other ways that government can play a role.
Rowan. Oh, Gabby.
Hi. In the spirit of giving credit where it's due, the Thriving Communities Initiative actually gets together the data from different utilities companies. So when someone's experiencing disadvantage, they often share that data with other utilities companies, so someone doesn't have to tell them that they're going through a hairy domestic violence situation. So you can read about that in our report, which is coming out on the 11th of November. The question that I had, perhaps for Laura maybe, was around the use of admin data. Like, there's a lot of researchers who are chomping at the bit to get access to linked administrative data within governments, and usually for the purpose of predictive risk modelling and things like that. And one of my concerns is around interactions with the justice system and the introduction of biases through that, because often that leads to two levels of human biases that have entered into that decision-making process. I was wondering if there was any professional training for researchers, or whether researchers were thinking about that in that context around the ethics of the use of data and administrative data in particular.
So can you tell me what you mean specifically, like what kinds of data sets you're talking about with administrative data?
So for example, justice data, if someone's been sentenced, that often is a source of two sets of human biases. One, they've been picked up, and two, they've been sentenced. So that automatically leads to some, there's some racial biases in that data. So is there concerns among researchers, and is that being thought through?
Yeah, so from my perspective, I don't think machine learning should be used in policing right now, period. Just because the state of our data is not in a place where I think people's lives and sentencing should be at stake. That said, I know MIT and the Media Lab is doing a lot of really, really interesting work on this topic specifically, and how you can address, using AI in policing is going to happen eventually, whether or not we like it. So they're doing a lot of really interesting research to figure out how it can be rolled out in a way that's fair and is using data that isn't historically prejudiced and discriminatory.
And we also have to rethink, if you look into research, and especially research of certain kinds of data sets, you do have typically review boards that oversee some of what you're going to do with the data. The existing review boards not always are as sophisticated to deal with big data sets, but I think that would be one place where you can actually make a lot of progress, is actually reinvigorating research review boards that can review what is the question, what is the purpose of having access to the data, and have you looked into what the biases, but also the representativeness of the data might be. And so that's where, from a research point of view, you can make a lot of progress.
Great. Rowan.
Melinda, thanks. You asked for us to call out potentially some shards of light here, and in certain areas, and I think one thing I'd just point to in the Australian context, Laura, you asked for examples, is a really interesting space that's going on with our National Disability Insurance Agency, which is a relatively new body in Australia. And it was charged, it's an agency of a government program to support people with disability, and it is charged with that purpose, but it is essentially a market maker. So Stefaan, on your point, I think if I can go back to the unedifying and absolutely hopeless discussion that we had in relation to universal medical record in this country at the government level, because we had and I'm not talking about officialdom here, I'm talking about the political class, but we had such self-evident opportunity to render public goods, but we were so inept at having the national conversation about it that we couldn't get the positive advantages for the community communicated in a manner that would actually get us across a level of community disquiet. Now, that was an example of, I think, government at large not behaving well, and so my experience, Melinda, is now that officialdom is asking business for give us use cases that help us generate an authorising environment, which is interesting. But my point there is that I think government in that instance was confused. What is my role here? Am I steward in a traditional sense? Am I concerned about legal rights? Am I concerned about privacy? Or am I doing something else? Am I provoking, future advantages? If I move over to the NDIA example, there is an agency specifically charged with generating a market where there was no market before and to be a market steward. Now, it's had its own problems in trying to think about its own role, but relatively recently, it's come to its own realisation. They've said, hang on, one of the things that we are in relation to this market is a data steward. And so they have just recently released quite an advanced, in my view, data sharing and data collaboration framework, which is going to be active. And the positive public good here is better data for better markets to bring better and cheaper and more effective services to vulnerable people in vulnerable communities. So I just point that out, but I just wonder whether or not there's some reflections there for government is least effective when it doesn't know what it's doing, and perhaps your point about market stewardship is something for governments to reflect on.
I can jump in there, and I mean, what I was going to ask is for some nodding heads if this resonates. I mean, I think one of the things that Stefaan said earlier was this focus on the 100 questions, and I think to me that's something that really resonates in the sense that if you don't have an anchor for the conversations, if you don't have an anchor for what the heck this is for, it becomes very difficult to construct any sort of conversation or narrative around it, much less a positive one. And so, and I think that's one of the things we try to do in talking about the benefits of data access in the PC's report was to actually use health and focus on some use cases. The interesting thing is that they just don't seem to have gained traction. So I think there's a big issue there. So I think that's how I would join those dots. I think if you don't, talking about stewardship, if you don't know where you're supposed to be heading is kind of challenging. And so that's why I think for me this whole conversation around how do we even start a conversation around stewardship on technology and data, what are the pieces that we pick off, and that's why I think the TAP project is so interesting, because it's been very explicit in picking off areas where progress can be made, and as Laura explained, thinking about the different stages where information gaps or capability gaps are leading to outcomes that are less than desirable, and how do you fill those? We had a really great conversation last night about the ethical piece and what role universities might play, which then sort of got us back down the line to secondary education. We started off talking about, educating engineers, and then people went, well, hang on, technology now is so much broader than that, and what fields don't involve technology. So there's a really interesting conversation that sits there, but practically focused on how do you start building the skill sets. It's one of the reasons I was attracted to reaching out to Laura, because educating politicians and people up on the Hill in the US, so that when their legislation is coming to them, they have an understanding about broadly what that technology is and really highlighting the risks around it. I think are all sit within that as well. A slightly long-winded sort of answer, but I think one of the other things that Laura was talking about last night that's worth highlighting, and it draws back this point about the role of finance. So again, looking for points where you can come into these challenges and start making a difference. This thinking around how you make investment decisions based on, the ESG sort of lens. Laura said specifically last night, how long do we think it's going to be until it's ESGT? And the toolkits that they've developed for entrepreneurs to be thinking about that. And we talked about, so artificial intelligence, everyone's talking about that. Human-centred design, I mean, it is all the rage. And Laura sort of highlighted that, well, actually I might get you to tell the example as the sort of last anecdote, if you like, around how that can be, it's good, but also how you need to broaden your thinking around that.
Yeah, so I think human-centered design is great. I think design thinking is fantastic, being able to really deeply understand your users. As long as you pair it with thinking about unintended consequences and people that might use your technology that you didn't intend on. So has anyone heard of the company called Lyrebird, Lyre, Lyrebird? Yeah, it's a voice cloning company based out of Canada. And this reporter interviewed the CEO a couple years back saying, have you thought about all of the ways that your technology could be used, maybe in ways that you didn't intend on? And so their claim to fame is that if you give about 5 seconds of your voice, in a minute they can do a 99% match, and then you can say whatever you want. And even on their website, they have a clip of President Obama and President Trump saying just really crazy stuff. So they asked, have you thought about some of the ways this technology might be used in ways that aren't so good for society? And they were like, well, we developed the technology for the field of speech synthesis, and we think it's really, really important. And the guy said again, okay, but what happens if it's used for other purposes? The response was, well, the technology is going to be developed anyway. We were very clear with our users. We were very particular with who we marketed this to. So it's sort of up to the community to decide. Of course, there was a scandal a couple of weeks later and someone using it for unfortunate political means. But I think it's really, really important. A lot of times people talk about technology being used in all of these negative ways, so you should have known from the get-go. But in addition to technologies that are just developed for things that might have obvious privacy risks, we need to think about the unintended consequences of some of these technologies as well. So that's not to say that Henry Ford would have known about climate change when he was inventing the car, but there are steps along the way that we as a society can take to think about how we're making sure that as the technology evolves and develops, we're taking care of society.
And the specific example that Laura was talking about last night was actually scenario planning and thinking about how you test for things well outside what you might be thinking about, which really resonated from my perspective around the way transparency around risks and risk management within a company framework are evolving. So that really resonated with me. But if I've got to close up now, I'm going to put a big bow around this and say I think that when we start with purpose and the questions that you want to answer, a lot of these other things can sort of fall out of that, if you like. If you start with that and then think about, well, what is the right pathway to get there? What is the right stewardship? What are the uses? And how do we bring the broadest possible group into that conversation in a way where it's effective and they have a voice and these things are considered is where we need to get to. But sitting beneath that is if you're going to bring voices into the conversation, lifting the understanding is good, because I think, Stefaan, you talked about the conversation which is so often experts or very little knowledge, and how do we bridge that gap. So I think there's a lot in there for us at CEDA to be thinking about in terms of a potential agenda forward. I will extend the invitation again for people to reach out to me or anyone else in the team to have further conversations about that, or things that you felt from either Stefaan or Laura resonated as making sense in the Australian context now from your experiences. I would really appreciate that. And then all that's left for me to do is, one, thank you, Rowan, for Australian Unity's support for this event and sponsorship for the event. Very greatly appreciated. Thank Laura and Stefaan for their time. Laura for flying all the way out here, Stefaan for squishing us into your busy agenda, and thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.